which Chairman Schuster and Ranking Member Rahal asked Congressman Capuano and myself to head up starting last January. Currently, 33 states and 1 territory have enabling legislation for the use of public-private partnerships for infrastructure projects. There's considerable variation, though, between the states in terms of the types of projects authorized, the governance structures utilized, and the degree to which state legislatures approve these projects. States have also taken different approaches to creating public-private partnership offices within state government. Some have created standalone offices, while others operate within the State Department of Transportation. Today, we will hear from several states and learn how they select projects and use the value for money analysis. We are also interested in hearing lessons learned that other states would benefit from and exploring the most appropriate role the federal government can play. Today, we will hear from Mr. Douglas, and I know I'm not going to pronounce this right, Coulombe, so it's right the first time. Mr. Douglas Coulombe, Director of Virginia Office of Transportation Public-Private Partnerships. And is this Mr. Leif Dormshow? Mr. Leif Dormshow, Deputy Secretary, Planning and Project Management of the Maryland Department of Transportation. Mr. Brian A. Kindrow, Director of the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation, Office of Policy and Public-Private Partnerships. And Mr. Leon Corbett, who is the Project Finance Manager of the Florida Department of Transportation. So I want to thank each of you for being here, and I want to recognize at this time Mr. Capuano.
Nothing else to add at the moment.
Thank you very much. Mr. DeFazio.
No thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'll listen to the testimony.
All right. Well, that was short and sweet. So, Mr. Coulombe, you may begin your statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, other members of the panel. I have greetings from Governor Terry McAuliffe, our Secretary of Transportation, Aubrey Lane. We're all following the work of this panel, but also the larger committee in the Congress as we go forward. From the time that Virginia adopted its legislation in 1995 and updated it primarily in 2002, we've been a leader in public-private partnerships. We set up a permanent office in 2011, 2010, 2011, because we wanted to build a program of activity around this approach, not simply do a number of projects. We have an implementation manual and guidelines that are very detailed. It's a disciplined, sophisticated, consistent process throughout, and we think that's what it needs to be able to be successful over time. We've done more than a dozen large projects as P3s, and in 2012 alone, we've successfully procured 3 that were worth over $4 billion in capital investment. We have many projects ahead. We also screened out dozens of projects, and I think that's an important thing to note from the beginning. A disciplined process actually dictates that not every project fits under a public-private partnership rubric. In terms of innovative design, we know that design-build contracts provide time and cost efficiencies primarily by combining the efforts of the design and construction teams early in the process. A public-private partnership procurement also adds other efficiencies such as life cycle cost savings that are achieved through the appropriate transfer of risk and maintenance risks and so forth to the concessionaire. Our value for money analysis are very interesting. We have a dynamic process, so we use value for money analysis at different times for different reasons and in different forms. Up front in our screening process, we use value for money to compare the different delivery methods that are available to better understand advantages and challenges there. Later in the process, we actually use value for money analysis to more seriously weigh the risks that are involved in a project and make sure that they're appropriate to the course we're on. And then finally, we update the value for money analysis at the end once we get the actual numbers from the best value proposal that we receive. So by constantly referring back to our original formulas, our original intent, our original need, our original why, through value for money analysis, we have quite an informed decision that keeps us consistent. In terms of risk transfer and so forth, we look at each project individually, and we can go into that a little bit more in the questions and answers. But basically, we try to remove things like competitive advantages or disadvantages might accrue to a public agency, such as the lack of need to pay taxes from the equation, so we really have an adjusted risk profile that we can make a good, honest decision about how to proceed. We haven't used availability payments in Virginia because we've concluded we currently don't have legislative authority to do so. It's something that's under discussion in the Commonwealth. As we look at how other states are using it, it may be something in the future. In terms of risk transfer, traditional design build already transfers price risk and schedule risk, but there are other risks that P3s allow you to transfer. Operations and maintenance risk, environmental risks, for example, hazardous materials or historic properties, acquisition of water quality permits, and so forth. Private partners are often able to manage those types of risks better than the public sector, particularly when you put the design, construction, operation, and maintenance together and align them. The public interest is something we have emphasized in Virginia. Ours is an open process that encourages citizen involvement at every stage, and we're taking this now as we rewrite our guidelines and implementation manuals to beyond the traditional public notice and public comment periods. Often those are sterile and don't really give us much information that we can use, but really talking about public engagement. And I'd like to get into that a little bit more in a question and answer as well, because I think it matches up the way the market responds. It's people as consumers of transportation services that become important. This goes all the way through to an independent audit that is paid for by the successful procurer that, again, validates our approach up until that time. In terms of lesson learned, clearly planning up front is very important. Strong state finances often produce more balanced deals. It's important to see the public engagement process as a part of every stage of the P3 development, and we are working always to increase competition at the end of the process. In terms of the federal government role, finally, we see 4 roles potentially the federal government is uniquely positioned to serve. 1 is champion of this process. 2 is an investor in it. 3 would be a catalyst for the activity itself. And 4 would be lender, particularly to state infrastructure banks who can use these tools and resources. So I look forward to answering your questions, and thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to be with you.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Dormshow.
Thank you, Chairman Duncan and Ranking Member Capuano. My name is Leif Dormshow. I'm the Deputy Secretary of Transportation in the state of Maryland. We appreciate the opportunity to participate in this roundtable discussion on P3s. I'd like to emphasize that we think there are tremendous benefits to public-private partnerships, but they are not a substitute for traditional funding sources. P3s can be a valuable tool in the toolbox, but they should be viewed as a supplement to predictable, stable federal and state investment in transportation. Our program is in the earlier stages of development in comparison to my colleagues in Virginia. We've taken more of a project-driven approach as opposed to a broader programmatic approach. But I do think that we've got some very relevant projects that can be windows into good policy. The first project I'd like to talk about is the Seagirt Marine Terminal project. That's a container facility at the Port of Baltimore. And the second project is the Travel Plaza project on Interstate 95. Both are revenue risk projects and did not require any state investment or state subsidy. Okay. Sorry about that. Prior to the enactment of our new legislation in 2013, we advanced the Seagirt Marine Terminal project and the travel plaza projects in a very similar manner. And then all the projects that we're going to be doing on a go-forward basis will benefit from a new law that incorporates a lot of the lessons learned from those two projects into how the legislature maintains oversight of our program, goes through the analysis and review of the projects, and ultimately gives us the green light to advance those projects. So the real first project that set the stage for P3s in Maryland was the Seagirt Marine Terminal project. It was a design, build, operate, maintain, and finance project. It was a brownfield project where a public terminal was conveyed to a private party for 50 years under a lease and concession agreement. And with that lease and concession agreement, the operator was obligated to make an upfront investment of $110 million in a new berth that could receive vessels that have drafts of 50 feet, so that we were building for the post-Panamax environment. So when the Panama Canal project is completed, we want to be able to receive the larger vessels. We are now one of only 2 ports on the East Coast that can do so. We share that honor with the Port of Virginia. In addition to that $110 million upfront investment by the concessionaire and operating entity, we were provided $110 million of upfront compensation for the right to have that 50-year lease. We use that money for supporting highway and tunnel projects in the Baltimore region, supporting the surface transportation system that supported the port and freight. It was $250 million in total, $110 million in capital expenditure, and $140 million in cash. Also built into that contract was a annual payment starting at $3 million and escalating with inflation that was paid to the Port of Baltimore, and then incremental participation in revenue once a certain volume of containers had been met. So both a guaranteed revenue source and also a variable revenue source that was dependent on growth at the port. Important in all of that was the ability of the state to eliminate the downside volume risk at the port while maintaining the upside in revenue participation. We also retain key public interests like policing and homeland security responsibility. We provided the impacted employees an option to retain their public sector job or be eligible for employment with the private party. We shifted 50 years of expensive capital renewal to a third party. And we really incented, because of the long-term nature of the relationship, we incented the third party to think of innovative ways to operate the facility and to fast forward certain technological investments that the state otherwise would have probably delayed. Those types of operational benefits are the real focus of the Maryland P3 program. We view P3s as at most 5 to 10% of our capital program. So we really do focus on projects where there's a great deal of opportunity to integrate the development of a new asset and its long-term maintenance and operations. And so those principles are really at work when you think about our next large project, which is the Purple Line Transit Project. It's a light rail project in the Washington, D.C. suburbs. Again, we're pursuing this project as a fully integrated design, build, operate, maintain with a private financing component as well. It's a 16-mile line. It connects with WMATA Metro Rail, Metro Bus, Amtrak, and our MARC commuter rail service. It's one of a class of New Starts transit projects along with the Green Line extension in Boston that have received full funding grant agreement recommendations from USDOT. There will be a large $900 million New Starts grant component of the project, along with TIFIA loan, private activity bonds, and state and local contributions. This is a real groundbreaking project in the sense that there aren't light rail examples of availability pavement structures and the combination of TIFIA and New Starts funding. So we think that it's an example that can be replicated on a go-forward basis. We think there's a lot of opportunities around the country for critical projects that deliver transportation mobility to be supported with this type of structure. Our view is that the availability payment structure really allows the owner to retain leverage that they normally don't have when they conventionally deliver a project. Transit properties in particular, transit agencies in particular, do a pretty suboptimal job when it comes to estimating what the long-term costs are of a transit service. They tend to underestimate the degree that systems need to integrate with each other, and the riders and the public experience a lot of service outages and also costly repairs after the facility has been developed. So again, our focus is really on that operating phase of the project, and we like the idea that through the P3 mechanism, the concessionaire's capital is tied up in the project for a long period of time. Therefore, their debt and equity is subject to deductions, it's subject to penalties, it's subject to default if they're unable to perform the types of tasks and deliver the outcomes that we're looking for in terms of service quality. We think that marrying up the availability payment structure with this particular type of asset is a good development. As far as the support that we're getting from the federal government, the TIFIA office and FTA have been outstanding. We'd like to see in the future maybe more formal teaming between those particular offices. Currently, it's somewhat of an ad hoc setup. We think that there's some benefit to thinking through giving states and localities more flexibility in the use of federal funds as a source of availability payments. And we certainly think that maintaining or expanding the TIFIA loan program is vitally important so that owners take a lot of these risks and advance these projects and put our own, our own money into these projects alongside the federal money.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Kindrow.
Sure, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, and the other members of the panel, and pleased to see Congressman Barletta and Congressman Perry from Pennsylvania as participants. And again, just want to thank you for your interest in this subject and in light of the pending authorization bill. I think there's a lot of opportunity to continue to provide some of the tools that we've been taking advantage of in the other states and in Pennsylvania that we hope to take advantage of. We're a relatively new entrant to the P3 market, so to speak. Our authorization was passed in 2012. We just had a recent transportation funding package passed the General Assembly this past year. So the combination of the two things, I think, put us in a strong position to deliver on some pretty exciting projects and also address some glaring needs and weaknesses within the Commonwealth right now. The authorization is fairly broad. It applies not just to the Department of Transportation within the Commonwealth, but also other public entities that may provide transportation-related services. So, for instance, SEPTA, which is the Transit Authority in Philadelphia, could take advantage of this authorization, or the Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission, or even smaller county transit authorities have the ability to take advantage of the authorization. As far as screening for projects, There's essentially two ways a project can come to be. The General Assembly allowed for unsolicited proposals to be part of the process, which gives the private sector an opportunity to come to us with ideas for projects that they may have. There still must be a competitive RFP process, so there's no sole source opportunity or built-in advantage to necessarily bring in unsolicited to us. But I think it's important that there's an avenue for those ideas to at least be put in front of some of the senior people within the department and within the government to consider whether they are projects we should pursue. I think majority of the projects, though, we expect to be advanced as what would be referred to as solicited projects, which are projects that we within the department or the Commonwealth determine are projects that could benefit from being delivered through a P3 procurement mechanism. One of the things that I think people have come to understand is that P3 isn't a solution to funding. It's merely a procurement tool that allows us to deal with projects, I think, more efficiently and effectively and accelerate the delivery of projects. So, again, that goes back to without the funding package, I think that it passed the Commonwealth this past year, there would have been probably minimal opportunity to do many capacity-adding P3 projects because we wouldn't have had, frankly, the public share to bring to the table to support those projects. We have a P3 board that's appointed by the four caucuses of the General Assembly and has three appointments from the governor, the Secretary of Transportation, the Secretary of Budget, and an at-large governor appointee. They are the front-end approval of any projects, so the department would go to them with a scope of what we envision a project to be, and the board would consider whether or not to approve that. It's pretty broad in terms of what their approval would entail, so it could be everything from a fully conceived project with plans in the whole 9 yards to more or less concepts. But once it's approved, we have to operate within those parameters. So, for instance, if they approve a project that doesn't have any tolls on it, the department doesn't have the authority to add tolls to that project later on in the procurement. So they set the boundaries from which we can essentially operate in. And once their approval, there's a limited window for the General Assembly to veto that approval. But once that window passes, essentially the procurement becomes the sole responsibility of the public entity. In our case, it would be the Department of Transportation in the Commonwealth. The first major project, infrastructure-wise, that we're taking a look at in the Commonwealth is the replacement of 550 to 650 bridges as part of one P3 contract. An article was just released this past week that basically reaffirmed Pennsylvania's dubious distinction of having the worst bridges in the country. It's something that we've placed a lot of attention on. A lot of the stimulus and ARRA money, as well as an accelerated bridge program under the previous administration, which was a bonding program. We've gotten the number of structurally deficient bridges in the Commonwealth down from well over 6,000 to now 4,000, but that's still too many. And the funding that was passed will give us an opportunity to address about 700 additional bridges in the next 10 years. But these 550 to 650 will be above and beyond even that. Our goal ultimately is to get to 10% structurally deficient bridges in the Commonwealth. Some of this isn't our own doing because of the freeze-thaw cycle and where we're positioned, the age of the Commonwealth, the number of highway miles that we have, the number of roads that we're responsible for, as well as the number of streams and creeks and river crossings are a lot of the drivers for this. But nonetheless, it's an issue that is obviously front and center in the Secretary's mind and the Governor's mind. And we think that by delivering it as a P3 project, it gives us the ability to do it as efficiently and effectively as possible. It'll be an availability payment deal, and it'll be, I think, the first of its kind in terms of the United States of a multi-asset project where you essentially have what would normally be 550 to 650 individual projects that are now bundled as part of one contract. It's a design, build, finance, maintain. So we're asking the private sector to essentially bear the full responsibility, transferring the design risk and the construction risk, but we're also transferring the long-term maintenance risk. The benefit to that, I think, with a lot of P3 projects, is most DOTs under a design, bid, build scenario essentially draft the specs, and a contractor then finds the cheapest way to meet those specs, and then the assets immediately handed over to the DOT to be responsible for maintaining. that doesn't get you that gets you the cheapest cost of construction. It doesn't get you the cheapest life cycle cost. There's obviously a lot that has to be done on these assets for a long period of time. So we think by doing it as a P3 project, we're getting the best value in terms of life cycle cost, not just the cheapest cost of construction. The other project that we're beginning to focus on is an Amtrak project, or a project I would say along Amtrak's Keystone Corridor, which runs from Harrisburg to New York via Philadelphia, especially the stations west of Philadelphia, between Harrisburg and Philadelphia. A lot of them have been left to rot over the years. The Commonwealth is responsible for a large portion of the subsidy, both of the operating and capital of that Amtrak service. So we're working with Amtrak and we're working with SEPTA to look at how do we redevelop that corridor, expand parking opportunities to grow ridership, and also to provide a safer ADA accessible facility that's secure and people will feel comfortable using and going to. So again, we're a relatively new entrant to the market with our first project under procurement, but we're looking to states like Virginia and Maryland and Florida and Texas and some of the others who have been around for a little longer as to how they've developed their programs, because we view it as important to have a stable program behind any project that you're doing. That there needs to be transparency in the process and consistency in the process, and that folks understand kind of the different steps that you're going to take to ultimately get to commercial and financial close, which is when you sign the contract with the private team.
All right, good job. For some reason, Pennsylvania gets a lot of attention on this committee.
Can't imagine why.
All right, thank you. Mr. Corbett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the members of the panel for having Florida come today. And I'm happy to talk to you about public-private partnerships in Florida. DOT has been working on P3s for about 8 years now, and really two different categories. One we'll focus more on today, I'm sure, is the design, build, finance, operate, and maintain P3. In Florida, we've been doing availability payment P3s. The other category we've been pursuing is design, build, finance, and we've done about a dozen of those. And those are short-term project advancements with short-term contractor financing. The availability payment P3s are probably what have set Florida apart. We were the first in the nation to do the I-595 corridor improvements project. And that was a $1.2 billion project with a 5-year construction period and a 30-year operations and maintenance period. We followed that with the Port of Miami Tunnel project, a $663 million design and construction cost. Same sort of setup, availability payments, 30-year operations and maintenance period. We've taken a selective approach when looking at the long-term concession agreements. We've looked at, per our statute, we've looked at public benefit and cost effectiveness for every P3 we do. When we get into the long-term availability payment deals, we've done a value for money study. We're working on another project, the I-4 Ultimate project right now. Just selected a best value proposer last week on that project and looking to reach a financial close on that project in the Orlando area this summer. So, one of the things I think has already been touched on, but we were asked about innovative design and design build, and certainly the philosophies of design build are in the P3. There are opportunities for innovation from the design build contractor. I think what the design build finance operate maintain P3 does is it brings some new layers to the equation. One is the private sector investment and private loans. When you have that investment in the project, there's skin in the game. There's a greater interest in efficiency. There's more interest in innovation. The other layer I would add is the long-term O&M component, the long-term life cycle component. And so the concessionaire is building a project that they're going to live with for 30 plus years. And they're going to design to that O&M period. They may bring in an O&M contractor into the design phase to have a voice in that process. I mentioned we do the value for money analyses. We really focus on cost effectiveness with every P3, but we look at a value for money approach more as a best practice. We're sharing different analyses and scenarios with our governor and the legislature before we get approval to procure the project. And then as a best practice, again, we're looking at value for money when we're closing the project to make sure we've stuck to our principles and gotten the best value for the project. I mentioned that we were a leader in the availability payment type of P3. We've been able to get comfort with taking toll risk on our toll projects. This is just something in an established corridor. We've looked at traffic and revenue studies and said, you know, there may, depending on the project, there may be a windfall in the future that the state can enjoy and reinvest toll revenues into additional projects in that area. We found efficiencies with P3s, and I think that outweighs the additional finance cost. We've found that when you take several project phases and bring them together into a large P3, that brings you economies of scale, that brings you efficiencies. Another key point with big P3s, when you bring in TIFIA, when you bring in private activity bonds, you're reducing the cost of capital. So there are some tools out there that really help a P3 keep the cost of capital low and competitive. Risk transfer, we look at the concessionaire taking on the risk of construction overruns. They own the design, so if there are design flaws, they're having to remedy those. They have lenders looking over their shoulder. So they're very keen on keeping the schedule. So that's a benefit of the P3. But they're at risk if they don't keep the schedule. You know, they're at risk of defaulting on a loan. They also have the risk of the long-term operation and maintenance cost and renewal costs, resurfacing the highway. When we look at those costs, we see volatility. And so from the state perspective, we like the ability with an availability payment to lock in those long-term costs. And again, you know, it's the concessionaire's project from start to finish. So when they have that long-term view, I think there's some benefits of a P3 that you wouldn't get in a traditional procurement. There's some things we do to make sure the P3s are kept in the public's interest. First of all, the project has been deemed a priority project. It's been in front of the MPO. It's had public input, been through environmental reviews, and it's a project that's deemed necessary. We're just trying to advance it or advance multiple projects together at the same time. And so there are things that we look at with the availability payment deals. We put performance standards in the contract. There's a financial consequence if the concessionaire doesn't reach those performance standards. So that protects the public. Ultimately, we're the owner of the project. So it comes back to us. There are requirements for how it's handed back to us at the end of the contract. There are requirements on performance and payment bonds. So there are protections there. If there's a default and we need to step in, there's a bond there to help us hire someone to finish the project. Lessons learned, I think, you know, would mirror some of the other comments. You know, I think each project is unique, so you have to be flexible with a P3. You have to look at the individual risks for a project. Financial market conditions change as we go along, so you have to be flexible to those. Getting stakeholder support is critical for a project, just making sure people understand the value of the preferred delivery approach and educating them. Also, just recognizing that doing the due diligence up front is important, really studying the risks, really evaluating what the department is hoping to achieve through a public-private partnership and sticking to the main philosophies behind that. Finally, just a comment on the federal government role. I mean, we've benefited greatly from TIFIA. It's been critical to the affordability of public-private partnerships and other non-public-private partnership projects we have in Florida. Private activity bonds as well, very important to tools for P3s. Certainly the federal government has a role in oversight for major projects, and we've worked through those processes and recognized the value there. And I just would encourage you all to consider that each state will have unique conditions and each project has unique circumstances when looking at P3s.
All right, thank you very much. Very helpful. I'll be here for the full time, but some of my members have to leave, and so I'm going to give my time at this time to Mr. Meadows. He was here first on our side for any questions that he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank each of you for coming today. I guess for me is I was talking to a contracting and engineering firm about private-public partnerships. And they've done them all over the world. And the numbers that they talked about in Canada and in Europe were in the hundreds. And the numbers they talked about here in the United States were 5. And this was a major provider. So what would you say, and just ask very briefly and then I'll yield back, what are the 2 major stumbling blocks, whether they be political or financial, on why we're not doing more public-private partnerships? And please be candid in your responses.
I'll jump with that.
I would say there's, number one, there's a habit of looking at the low cost of capital as your primary factor in whether or not to move forward on a project. So our experience with tax-exempt instruments is pretty pervasive. When you begin to talk about risk at all, people are surprised there's risk. What do you mean there's risk? So there's a whole set of education and awareness activities that need to go forward. And I think we all, Virginia, just like the other states, started with a project or 2 to try to show the success of an alternate approach. But basically, we share with the private sector and others the need to really make this market. And so we all have that responsibility to try to figure out what the policy piece is, what the investment strategies are, which models work best, because going forward, financing is going to be even more important than it is now.
I think, excuse me, I think one of the major differences between the United States and Europe and Canada is that many of the assets that are, I think, become eligible for P3 delivery are owned locally in the United States, and they're owned at the national or provincial level in those other countries. So a lot of social infrastructure projects that were delivered through a P3 mechanism in the UK and Canada, were owned by a larger government entity, and they could kind of lean into those projects from a policy perspective or support those projects in terms of subsidy, and they could standardize their approach. You're dealing right now with 4 different states. We have 4 different general assemblies, 4 different laws, sets of laws, and then many of the assets that might be suitable for P3s in the social infrastructure space aren't controlled by state government. They're controlled by city government. So it's a whole nother layer of government. So
are you suggesting that we would take and put a federal guideline in terms of when federal funds are used? I would think that you probably wouldn't be in favor of that, but is that what you're suggesting? Because you're saying it's a national issue.
Well, I'm just saying that the assets that are the ownership of assets is a difference, across those national comparisons. I think that doesn't mean we should replicate what's been done in the UK and Canada. I think we need to, tailor our solutions to our public policy landscape and political landscape. I think there are things that the federal government can do to catalyze project delivery at the state and local level. I think TIFI is a great vehicle for that. The flexibility around loan terms and the standardization of their process and the reduction in the duration of their reviews and engagement with loan recipients. Those are all positive improvements that can be made. But I just think that there's a different set of laws in place. Many state general assemblies have taken action, so I think that it's not something that's static. I think it is improving. Pennsylvania's taken steps recently. Maryland's taken steps in the last 12 months. So I think that will help with the deal flow, will help with the assessment of these types of projects, and public representatives at the state and local level will, I think, become more comfortable with this as a potential option. Another thing that I think you need to be mindful of is that there is a bias towards design, bid, build in the engineering community in most regions. And so as engineers and firms get more experience working on P3 projects, I think there will be more serious analysis of this delivery model. Right now, many of the local engineering firms have been doing projects the same way for the past 50 years, and so they're evolving in their thinking, and they're staffing up, and they're making sure that they have this capability in-house as well. So I think the private sector is evolving, and I also think the public sector is evolving in this area.
Would you all agree with that?
Yeah, the only thing I would just I think that some of the early transactions were leasing of toll roads for 99 years, and they were hugely controversial. And I think, frankly, that stalled a lot of other good P3 projects from moving forward, because I think it kind of painted P3 in a broad brush that wasn't so favorable. I think we're now beyond that. I mean, with what states like Virginia and Texas and others have done, they've proven that not just because you've seen one P3 project doesn't mean you've seen them all. I think from our perspective, the most important thing is that we continue to have some of the tools that kind of bridge those financing costs between what you could get in the municipal bond market versus private financing. Things like TIFI and PABs help to do that. I think one concern going forward is, as we're now seeing more and more transactions, more and more projects coming forward, are those programs going to start to get tapped out, basically? And I think that's kind of what's coming on the horizon, is because the deal flow has been relatively low, that hasn't been an issue. But I think as more and more states have more and more developed pipelines of projects, I think it's going to become an issue.
We better move on. Mr. Capiano. All right, Mr. DeFazio.
I mean, since you mentioned the Burgess project, I'll take the first crack at it. I think you're right. I think a lot of us would acknowledge that state procurement is probably dated, in a lot of ways, and could stand to benefit from being reformed to allow for more innovation in the traditional procurement process. Regarding the bridges project specifically, the analysis we did is we basically had 3 pilot programs across the state where we bundled 5, 6, 7 bridges together. And when you're bundling bridges of similar design, you eliminate a lot of repetitive design processes. So it's not necessarily that we're going to get an innovative or new design. It's just that we're making a more efficient process in the design. And we saw.
But bundling doesn't necessarily lead to P3 with availability payments. I mean, in my state, when we had the contract on our I-5 bridges out, we entered into an innovative process in terms of how we bid out the packages, and it seems to me to be the same. Because the only hard comparison we've got, we have a water district that, they had some really hard, and the rates were substantially higher, but was from Canada, and it didn't quite come across. So I'm just trying to get at, if you said, okay, we want to bundle 500 bridges, we're going to put them out on a design bill with a 100-year lifespan or whatever it was. And did you compare that to this bundle with availability payments and that, and in fact, go straight up across certain costs?
I mean, we have to look to countries like Canada, frankly, because there's no way of comparing what the life cycle of these assets are going to be compared to a bridge that's built traditional design, bid, build, or any other way, frankly, until 30 years from now, or 50 years from now, or 60 years from now. I mean, our rationale for doing it was the economy of scale and bundling. We also spent a tremendous amount of money and resources on, frankly, inspecting to death every piece of the construction process. By having more performance-based specs and them taking on essentially a long-term warranty, which is what it is on these bridges, we're all of a sudden less interested in that. Are they following every step to a T on every single one of these 550 bridges? Because we know that if they're going to cut corners, ultimately that they're going to be the ones paying for those corners cut, having to go out there if they're responsible for the ongoing life cycle maintenance of the asset. If it starts falling apart, it's going to be at their cost that they're going out there fixing it, not at our cost. So we're a little less. We'll audit that process. We'll still have our inspectors making sure that the reports that are submitted and everything submitted. We'll do samplings, and we'll go around and do some universe of the bridges that we're comfortable that they are following all the steps and doing everything they need to do. But there's some of the processes that within the DOT where you're getting savings that are kind of ancillary to the project itself. And we've tried to work with our local contractors on warranties, for instance, and frankly haven't gotten very far with them. We haven't even gotten to the point where we're doing warranties, because that's not something they're willing to accept. It's something we're interested in because we think it makes a lot of sense. But
In the case of Lowing Bridges, you're assuming that this entity is going to be around for, life cycle you're asking for here.
it's a 25 to 30 years in this case. Sure, and there are continuing maintenance activities, going out cleaning the bridges. There's biennial inspections that are required by FHWA. There's annual inspections that get done, and that's all part of their ongoing maintenance of the facility too.
Ms. Miller.
Thank you. I thank all of you gentlemen for coming to this meeting, unfortunately, but I heard the rest of you. And, obviously we're real interested in seeing what we can do here at the federal level to incentivize this whole P3 thing that is certainly coming. Right? Nobody's got a stash in their blue jeans, whether it's any individual state or all the countries, et cetera, et cetera. And I know you mentioned about this is really not a funding thing, but I think there's hope that it really is a funding thing, because how do you sort of get force multiplier, I guess you could say, for some of the various projects. And I know I should be more generic, but I'm going to just throw something out that we're looking at in our state and pick your brains here a little bit. Oh, sure. I'm going to, as I said, I probably should be a little more generic in my questioning, but I'm going to take this opportunity to pick your collective brain trust here sitting in front of me about a project that we're sort of looking at Michigan, and we're one of the states that has not had enabling legislation yet for P3s, which of course you don't really need it, but it would be helpful, I think, to set the environment for the privates that come in here. And we're looking real serious, and you may have even seen our P3 guy at one. I'm sure you all go to the same conventions, seminars, et cetera, right? So you're all hearing about all these various projects around the nation or the globe, et cetera, that has some application and things that you're looking at in your respective states. But we actually have something that might be a little bit unique, and I just wonder if you've heard of anything like this anywhere in some of the border states. We're a northern border state. I'm from Michigan, a northern border state, and we have several ports of entry, land ports of entry, where we have these bridges that come in, one that happens to be in my area, which is the second busiest border crossing actually on the northern tier of the nation. So we're thinking maybe, because we've not had money in the budgets, the President's proposal or the Congress final budget for any plazas at any of our land ports of entries for a number of years. So anyway, this is an area where, if you look at the players, would be, first of all, an authority. There's an authority at the bridge. We're trying to build this plaza. And then you get the leasor, I guess, which would be GSA, and then the leasee, which would be Customs and Border Protection, CBP. And then our lead dog is MDOT. And I'm not even sure if we're even looking for private money, but we're thinking about a P3 with all these various groups here. The difference in probably any that you've looked at is actually a bridge authority, which is sort of the good news, because we do have a dedicated revenue stream, which would be similar to a toll kind of situation maybe you've seen. So I don't know if you have any thought, if you've seen anything like that anywhere in the country or at some of the other countries perhaps, or at land ports of entry, because there's a backlog of a couple of dozen of these plazas, a couple of dozen different sites along both the northern and the southern border of our country. So I think all of these border states are looking at doing something like that now.
I can maybe add some comments on our experience with the Port of Miami Tunnel. Maybe not exactly the quite same scenario, but it might be helpful. You know, the Port of Miami Tunnel was a project that they looked at for decades. I think going back to the 80s, they started recognizing the need to bring additional traffic into the port directly and bringing traffic out of downtown. And it, after years and years of study, we finally got availability payment authorization, and really that was the first availability payment project we looked at. And it took a combination of local support, local funding, state funding, basically sharing the construction costs between locals and state, and then ultimately had to bring in TIFIA to make it affordable and bring the project home. And the project closed right after the financial crisis. And I think what helped, there are two things that really helped in that time frame. One was the authorization we had in our statute to enter into a long-term agreement with that long-term availability payment stream. And that gave investors confidence that we had the authority to enter into the agreement and that payment stream would be there. And then, you know, certainly TIFIA coming into play brought the affordability to the project. Utilizing a concessionaire that had a contractor that had experience with tunnels and, you know, soft, porous ground material under Biscayne Bay, something the department wasn't experienced with at all. So it was one case where it definitely helped with our strategic initiative to bring Panamax ships into the port, and there's been a lot of investment, and so it's been part of a winning story in Florida.
Because I think one of the things we want to do with our working group here as we look at for the whole T&I committee, if we do put some of this into the reauth or however we proceed with the P3, is that you build the language, the legislation in such a way that it is an incentive for the states, but that we don't, you know, I mean, I'm a big believer in the 10th Amendment, you know, that we make sure that the states have the flexibility. As Mr. DeFazio was just talking about various technologies or anything, all we really want to do is just sort of build a framework let the thing happen here for whatever the length of the bill is, hopefully 5 years, to have the flexibility of the states, depending on all these various different components that would happen. That's really our charter, try to figure out something that can lend itself to being helpful with these things. So I guess that's another part of advice that we're looking for from you.
Well, Ms. Miller, in my remarks, I mentioned that Virginia does not use availability payments. So we looked at a similar situation with the Midtown Tunnel in Norfolk and saw that there was not just a policy need or a public need, there was actually a market need there. And of course, the market is what drives that toll and allows you to do the financial analysis that leads you to a certain way to finance the project. In that case, it's a little over $2 billion project. The state contribution is about $420 million. The TIFIA alone is about $422 million. The equity put in by the private sector, which again is unique to P3s, $220 million. And then the senior debt that was issued for the project, $675 million. So the package we put together was really driven by the ability to measure fairly accurately the use of the new tunnel facility, how much revenue it could generate at certain toll rates, and therefore how much financing and what kind of financial package you could put together based on that potential revenue.
You're from Virginia?
Virginia,
Yeah.
So we had similar kind of projects, if you will, and used different approaches to arrive at the same kind of result.
Just the only other thing I would say, just a question, I guess, because you all go to these conferences or what have you. I told our governor a couple of weeks ago that we ought to look at Virginia's as a template, but I'm sure you all think your individual states is probably the best piece of legislation. But is there a gold standard amongst the states of the P3 legislation that if it's one of the states that doesn't have the P3, and maybe you're not the right group to ask, but
I mean, I will say from Pennsylvania's perspective, our authorization language was similar to Virginia's, so we look to Virginia in a lot of ways, but we also look to what's going on in Canada, because I think that they've gone through some of these growing pains a lot more than we have and have evolved as a program. And I think some of the early challenges they have, we can learn not just from other states, but also from other countries that have been doing these for decades.
That's why we had them here the other day.
Thanks.
Ms. Norton.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to understand. I understand P3s from another entirely different sector, real estate, and I'm trying to get my arms around the analogies of any. Real estate value almost always goes up. It's liquid. It can be transferred in the market. Road is good only in the state for the use that it's been cut out for. One of you threw out the notion that 99-year leases, that was the old days. Well, the fact is, if you want somebody to do a design, build, finance, maintain, he's got to be in for the long haul, and he's got to make sure he gets his debt service and return. There's the Pocahontas Parkway in Virginia that showed some of the shortcomings of that was 99-year lease, but your Midtown Tunnel is 58 years, and in any case, your Virginia, your beltway, not your beltway, your hot lanes in Virginia, 80 years. Now, what I'm have a hard time is understanding is these are all toll roads of one kind or the other, are they? Are they not? Well, I want to understand the toll roads in particular. How you can, which I take it must depend upon volume. And if you're talking about an 80-year concession, is the risk transferred entirely to the concessionaire? And how can you, I mean, even the best economists will tell you that we can't figure out what the economy is going to look like 2 or 3 years from now. You can't figure in recessions. So when you have an asset that is almost totally dependent upon volume, And who will get stuck with it no matter what happens is the state. I don't understand these long-term concessions and how you can be sure that the state won't be left holding the bag.
Well, Ms. Holmes, in Virginia, like most states, we do a pretty rigorous risk assessment, of which revenue risk is a major factor. How many people will use a facility over time? We use our own expertise, but we also use models that are developed by the private sector, and particularly by the investment community, to try to get
80 years out?
Well, it's a projection. It doesn't mean it's going to exactly happen that way, but it's a way they're able to get to some understanding of how much value is being created, how much people are willing to pay for over time, and therefore what kind of financing package that would support up front. And quite frankly, sometimes the analysis shows that it's not a good deal. You mentioned the Pocahontas Parkway, for example. Part of the return on that potential project was supposed to happen in real estate development, and when the economy turned south, that type of development didn't occur.
You see, that's just the kind of
Sure.
just the kind of intervention I'm talking about. Real estate values will change.
True.
Real estate values will go up. There'll be recessions. They'll come down. There will be unforeseen consequences, climate change, in some parts of the of an area. And yet, this looks like essentially, when you're talking about an 80-year concession, you're selling it essentially. That's virtually a fee simple.
Well, most importantly, we're attempting to either share or transfer that risk to the private sector, because we recognize the public sector probably shouldn't accept all that risk all by itself all the time. The private sector as well will often put together a portfolio of these projects, any one of which may be riskier than another, but overall, if they have 10 projects around the world, they're looking at the performance of their overall portfolio as well as the performance of an individual.
Does that mean that one project could help save another, since you
definitely.
have a portfolio?
Yeah, definitely. It's just like having a mutual funds approach to investing instead of a stock-by-stock approach. Now, that's not the public interest, but I'm just saying the private interest. The second thing to remember is the investors have a different appetite for these things. A hedge fund, infrastructure fund, wants pretty high returns pretty quickly. A pension fund may love having a 5% return over an 80-year period because it matches the liability growth of their pension fund obligations. So the different investors that may be involved initially or throughout the life of the project actually may change.
How do you figure tolls over the tolls, which are the only source of income, tolls plus volume?
It's usually the same inflation factors that you use for what will the price of gasoline be or what's likely to be rents in a certain submarket and so forth. You adjust those as you go. And I know, for example, the I-95, 495 project, Hot Lanes project. For example, the ramp-up period has been slower than they expected and that we expected. But the result was the private sector, in this case Transurban, who testified before you or presented to you at your initial meeting, actually refinanced their side of the project, put more equity in, bought down the debt service so that the profile now matches more the revenue profile that they're actually seeing. So that's some factor to consider too. The private sector has the ability to adjust that financial picture on their side. I can't imagine having gone back to the General Assembly in Richmond and said, we need $200 million more. It just wouldn't have happened. They were able to go to their investors and make it happen.
Yes.
I just wanted to comment from the Maryland experience. We haven't done any toll road P3 projects, but I think your concerns are legitimate. And our General Assembly, which I think is certainly the most wise in the United States and passed the best P3 bill in the country, put in essentially a de facto cap on the duration of our P3 contracts at 50 years. And then they also have paid particular attention to the remedial rights that the owner has if things, are going badly. And so I think in a good well-structured P3 contract, the owner would always have the right to put the owner on put the concessionaire on notice to improve the performance and improve the asset condition. And if they fail to do that, you could step in and operate the facility yourself, or resale the concession to another party. So I think you have to have that check, so that if things do go south, there's a way for the government to remedy that relatively quickly, so that the public doesn't experience any degradation in the service. And in our case, the projects that we've done have been revenue risk projects for the concessionaire. We haven't put in any public subsidy. So if 4 or 5 years from now, and we're not hopeful that this occurs, but if 4 or 5 years from now, the Seagirt Marine Terminal, which is up and running, we've got the benefit of the investment, or the Travel Plaza project that we have on Interstate 95 that we're halfway completed on, if they're up and running, and for some reason the concessionaire experiences difficulty and the performance drops off, we're going to put them out, and we're going to get the benefit of the assets, and we'll just run them ourselves. So I think it depends on the particular asset, but I think you should have protections built in to a good contract that would address your concern.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thanks for your testimony. I want to focus on Pennsylvania since I'm from there and from the Pennsylvania legislature as well, and somewhat familiar with the P3 bill. We've heard some discussion. It seems to, for people that are concerned, and I think everybody's right to be concerned, but particularly about the cost of financing, and and maybe the profit that a concessionaire would make, or design build, that additional fee that would be built into the cost, and why would we do that if we could do it with public funds, public financing, typically cheaper, and so on and so forth. I would say too that it seems to me that, like the project you just discussed, it is an 80-year concession on it, but it's not going to be built otherwise. And so you either get a project with an 80-year concession, or you get no project at all. Or if you do build it with public funds, then the public owns it for 80 years and deals with the cost, and it's there, and somebody's dealing with one way or another. But one of the other things that I think is relevant to point out, and maybe you could help me out here. So we got the cost of capital, which is whatever it is more, and the concession cost or the profit for the private sector, but we don't talk about the additional cost of having government requirements on publicly funded projects. And I know in Pennsylvania, one of the issues that I had with Pennsylvania was a mandatory Davis-Bacon requirement. Mandatory. It was out of the bill, it was in the bill, it ended up in the bill. Even when you were just doing a state project. And so my question to you would be, where we say we don't know the cost incrementally over time of the P3 as opposed to the public project of the same type, and it's hard to compare apples and apples. I know in Pennsylvania, in two particular projects, we know exactly what the increased cost of the prevailing wage is, 14%. Two exact same projects bid two different ways. One, the project was awarded and had to be rebid, and the other one, it wasn't awarded but had to be rebid, the exact same project, and we saw the difference in the cost. And so with that, my question would be to you, would there be a gain, potential gain, if there was a threshold, let's say 50% plus one. So if there were 50% funding plus $1 of public funding would invoke prevailing wage or Davis-Bacon, and anything lower than that would not necessarily invoke it. Is that a potential for savings, or is it not? And is the additional cost associated with the prevailing, the artificial wage, if you juxtapose that with the additional cost of financing and concession fees, is there a trade-off that is equalized at all, or minimized, or maximized?
I mean, I will have to say, because the reality is, we have the prevailing wage law in the Commonwealth and Davis-Bacon applying on any projects where we accept federal funds. I'm sorry. because the reality is we have those laws that we obviously have to adhere to. I haven't seen any analysis kind of project to project on major state infrastructure projects as to what the cost difference is. I know that in the discussion regarding the recent funding package that was passed, there was a lot of interest, in particular the local governments who receive state money for projects, looking for some relief to prevailing wage laws in the Commonwealth, and they lifted the threshold as part of the funding package so that smaller maintenance projects weren't being required to have the same prevailing wage requirements as because that cap hadn't been lifted in decades, and frankly it needed to be adjusted. But I don't have any data or information in terms of big capital PennDOT projects of what the difference would be.
But just the fact that the locals asked for that change in threshold, I mean, why would they be asking for that if they didn't see some cost savings or think that they were going to see some cost savings? Is it just for the fun of the fight?
No, and I'm more or less just saying it's not something I can quantify that I have the numbers.
So, but we're looking at crafting federal legislation here, right? So would it be the time to address it after we craft the legislation, put it into place, and let it go for the next 50 years? And then say, well, let's revisit that and see what it is, or is the time to have a discussion now? And in your mind, based on what you know about the prevailing wage, at least in Pennsylvania, is it reasonable to assume that there's potential savings there or not?
Unfortunately, I'm going to have to punt on it. I mean,
anybody else want to jump in? I know it's a scary subject that nobody wants to get near, except for those who don't mind have a target on their back. Go ahead.
It's not a scary subject, but I think all of us in transportation at the state level realize there's a number of public policy goals that are really set outside our processes that we simply adhere to. So, for example, they're not impediments, but they're just policy priorities that you've set and others have set. Environmental stewardship, for example, the use of small minority and women-owned businesses. These are all things that we take for granted, and they're part of the framework we work in. Quite frankly, the way a P3 would work versus design build versus a traditional design bid build, probably the differentiator isn't these things that you were talking about. The potential for savings and the real potential for benefits, is much bigger than these things that are on the margin. That would be my observation. So, we don't waste much time trying to blue sky what somebody might change in terms of public policy. Each of these things are things that are set and given to us as priorities, and that's what we work with.
Thanks, Chairman. I want to thank you, gentlemen, for doing this. I find I've actually had a great time with this task force. I learned a lot and had some more useful discussions than we usually have with the big, huge committee rooms and all that. I wasn't going to ask about Davis-Bacon, but I need to. I presume that all these projects are subject to Davis-Bacon using TIFIA money, federal money, et cetera. Are there any exceptions? Because honestly, if you do, it changes the discussion here. We haven't had this discussion here, and I'm not really interested in getting into it because that's a debate for a different area. But if I find out that these projects are somehow circumventing Davis-Bacon, it will change the tenor of these discussions, and I'm not looking to do that. But now that it's been raised, I guess I just want to make sure that I'm not missing something.
Pete, I mean, from our perspective in Pennsylvania, I mean, nothing in our P3 authorization or nothing in federal law allows us to circumvent any of the...
And the use of TIFIA money, the use of federal money, all requires it anyway, and so as far as I know, there isn't.
Exactly. If there's federal aid, whether it be formula or discretionary funds in a project that Davis-Bacon applies. In Maryland, we have the added mandate within our P3 law that states specifically that we have to have prevailing wage.
I presume. I know you're not dumping used oil on the construction site into the local rivers. I get all that. And I just want to be sure that, again, I want to get back to the P3s. By the way, I'm sure we're not the first. Massachusetts did do 14 bridges 2 years ago with a package deal, and it was all in the stimulus money. I hate the word error because those of us who voted for it don't get any credit for it once we use the word error. It was stimulus money. It fixed 14 bridges in Massachusetts. It was a P3 project, but it was a design build. which I find, I don't like even thinking of design build as P3, but apparently technically it is, but I don't see it that way. What I want to do is I've been asking for numbers for everybody who comes, and you guys, some of you guys have provided some interesting numbers, and I want to go through them in a minute. But part of the number problem is transparency, if you want the truth. I mean, some of you, depending on, sure, different states do it differently. Some of you have all these discussions, and you just announce you've done a P3, and these are the agreements, and nobody knows what was in them until you've announced them. And again, I'm not going to get individual states or which ones you do, but that is a problem for me in general. I think these discussions should be public as much as possible. Just today, my staff got an email from CRS, the Congressional Research Service, which we find to be relatively neutral, intelligent, thoughtful people who have access to great information. We've been asking them to look into some of the numbers relative to P3s. Just today, they got an email from the Indiana toll road people saying, sorry, we can't tell you the revenues. It's proprietary. It's like, well, how can we possibly judge these things without knowing this? And so that's been my problem, and I want to jump into a couple of the items that have been put out. Some of them they'll jump around a little bit, but they're mostly the Maryland and Florida ones because those are the ones that struck me as the most useful. No particular reason, just the ones I happen to come across. The first one is the travel plazas. On the travel plazas, when you did the financial analysis, I presume that those travel plazas are just like the ones in Massachusetts, right on the highway, Burger King, gas station, typical thing like that. I presume that you do it no differently than we do, which is when Burger King and a gas station wants to come into those travel plazas, they pay the Commonwealth, the state, X amount of dollars, basically a lease, a concession fee. You may take some money out of the machines that are inside, whatever it might be. But there are concession fees involved with that. I assume that's the normal course of business. When you took this into account, did you take into account the lost revenue from those concessions that you would no longer be having as a lost revenue to the state? Do you know?
Yeah, I do know the structure of the deal. What we did was the basic way to understand the revenue share is that there's a percentage of gross receipts that is paid to the Transportation Authority in Maryland based on the sales. And so prior to the P3, with the old legacy facilities, their percentage of gross receipts shared with us was between 17 and 20%. So those were facilities built in 1963, and then the other one was built in 1972. So when we replaced them, we assumed that the share of gross receipts was going to go down because we were asking the concessionaire to spend the money to improve the facilities. They spent $65–70 million. So the best way for us to determine fairness was to measure our percentage of gross receipts against comparable facilities on the East Coast. And we were the beneficiary of P3 projects done ahead of us in Delaware, Connecticut, and Florida. So our assumption was that we would be at 5%, that they would offer us 5%. And anything less than that, we thought wasn't worth doing. The deal we negotiated was actually 10% of gross receipts, scaling up to 15% of gross receipts. And that was 2 times or 3 times the rate Pennsylvania, Connecticut, or Delaware was able to achieve. So we thought that we got that one right.
All right. I want on the terminal. Some of the numbers are very interesting, particularly the one on the container, the per container cost. As I understand it, container comes off a ship, Massport, Port of Baltimore gets money.
Yeah.
They pay them X amount of dollars for every container that comes out. And you take account $15 for containers over 500,000. Did you also take into account the money that you're losing by, I have no idea what they get per container, but let's assume for the sake of discussions it's $30 per container. You're getting $30 now, and you're going to get 15 later because half of it's going to go to the operator. Yeah. And I see the positive side of it. I don't see the negative. And again, this is not an actual, a cost analysis, but it strikes me that by simply putting the one aspect in, you're kind of putting your thumb in the scale by possibly a lot of money. And I don't know the answer to it, but I'm just wondering, did you take it into account? And if so, what kind of money are we talking about? You were more than happy to do quickly $15 for everything over 500,000 for $465 million, but $465 million compared to what would you have generated if you had done the project traditionally? And that, to me, is really the comparison. It's not what you're getting as if you didn't get anything. You would have dredged the harbor, because we're dredging our harbor. We're all doing it. We're all going to 50 feet. And we're all going to get these Supermaxes and all that other stuff. So you're going to get these containers one way or the other. This is and I really want to be real clear. I really appreciate your comment about the fact that P3s are not a substitute for traditional funding. I've never seen them that way. I see them as kind of extra for certain projects. The question is which projects. But I've had real problems, first of all, getting numbers, as I said, and second of all, comparing apples to apples. And I'm just, on this one, it's not just what you're going to get. It's also what you would have gotten if you had done it on your own. That's, I would think, the real comparison. I'm just wondering, did you do that?
Yeah. So what we did was, these are very good questions. I'm not defensive in the slightest. And if we have to get you more information, we can certainly do that. What we did was we looked at the enterprise of the Seagirt Marine Terminal over its history and how it performed. And some years it made money, and some years it lost money. And that's a relatively straightforward accounting. And so what we essentially did was that in the best years, it made $1.5 million or $2 million. I don't have the exact figures. In the worst years, it would lose $4 million. Terminals, container terminals, are loss leaders. Port of New York, New Jersey loses $100, $150 million a year in their ports district. You don't do it, to make money on the dock. You do it to create jobs and the economic vitality that goes with having freight movement, in your region. I don't know what, loss Massport takes on containers, but they certainly take a loss.
Absolutely.
Okay. So what we did was we took the best we'd ever done, and we essentially said to the concessionaire, we want to get paid twice that going forward, guaranteed. And then we want that amount to grow with inflation. We took out the bottom.
All right, so the way this is presented is simply a means to an end. You knew how much you wanted to get, and that's the way you determined to do it.
Yeah, and that $15, that's over and above that base fee. So the base fee was, if a single container if we don't get a single container in the future, we're going to get twice as much as what we got in the best years historically, and then it's going to grow by inflation. Now, if things turn out better than that, and that's what we're playing for success, not failure, right? So we're playing to get the incremental $15 container. So when that kicks in, we're doing better than we were.
I understand.
Even if it was just.
See, I'm just trying.
So we took out the bottom, and we just.
I'm just trying to get, and I'm going to get into the roads, but you didn't have the roads that were interested. The one was interesting most of was Florida, because I understand roads a little bit. And again, to me, as we're getting into this, it does strike me as P3s are probably best for things like new tunnels, things like terminals, things where there's a clear and unequivocal, isolated thing. I'm not so sure. I'm not convinced yet that they're good for things like bridges. I don't know yet, open-minded, but it's a real question mark. These are less question mark, but because apples and apples are a little bit different, but roads, a whole different issue. My presumption is, yeah, okay, that's fine, that's good.
Thank you, Mr. Candido. First of all, I'd like to recognize your work on P3s, and thank you for being instrumental in drafting and implementing Pennsylvania's current P3 authorities. I think I heard you say that the state of Pennsylvania was going to finance the P3 bridge bundling through availability payments. My question is, what is the potential impact of the availability payments on PennDOT's future construction program?
We've been very conservative, frankly, over the years in terms of the amount of money we borrow, whether that's through bonding or otherwise. There was a $500 million bonding program under the previous administration, but prior to that, it had been several years since the department had borrowed any money. The project was significantly smaller prior to the transportation funding bill passing the General Assembly. So with the revenue increase that came from that funding package, it allowed us to frankly afford more for the period of the contract to put additional bridges in it. And I think one thing that's important to keep in mind is at a DOT, at some point you cross the threshold of deciding that asset or those collections of assets need to be addressed now. And we can't afford to wait the 10, 15, 20 years kind of on a pay-go basis to do it that way. I mean, there's an acknowledgement that there's a cost of finance no matter how you do it. And that's going to have an impact. I mean, it's kind of like buying a house. I mean, you're not going to wait till you have that $150,000, $200,000 for the house before you go buy it. You're going to go to the bank and you're going to get a mortgage, and they're going to ask for a small rate of return on that for the risk of you paying that back over the time you're living there. We kind of take the same approach. I mean, these are critical bridges, critical assets that need to get repaired. So if we were only able to do 700 in the next 10 years on a pay-go basis, this allows us to add another 550 to 650 on top of that, so we can address what we think is a critical need. When you're talking about bridges that are average years of 70 years old, frankly, some of these bridges are going to get shut down or are going to need to be replaced anyway in that 10 years, and we're just going to have to defer other projects to be able to get there and do that. And that's where it comes back to the idea of the closer you can bridge that gap between the cost of bonds versus private finance with tools like TIFI and PABs is critical, because then it allows us to shift some of the schedule risk, some of the construction risk, some of the long-term maintenance risk over to the private sector, so they're bought in, they have skin in the game, and they're at risk for some of the things that traditionally we would take all the risk on over the life of a project.
And how I'm going to, this is for everyone, how do the states ensure that the P3 procurement process is transparent? And can you speak about the involvement of the local contractors in the P3 project process?
From Pennsylvania's perspective, I'll address the local contractors and maybe let the other folks talk about procurement process since they've done more projects. There's local contractors, frankly, that were excited when the P3 authorization passed because they've done these types of projects in other states and found them very successful and a good opportunity to grow their business. There's some contractors that I think are just, they want to be educated. They want to learn more. They want to understand more. And as you may imagine, there's a group of contractors that like the way things are now, and anything different is going to be something that concerns them as to what does this mean for us. Our traditional program is $1.6 billion of contracts let. Next year it'll grow to $2 billion worth of contracts, and we're talking about kind of 1% of that pie going through the P3 project as part of this bridge project. And once we capture these 500 to 600 bridges, it's not like we have another 500 to 600 bridges that are similar design, ready to go. So a majority of our projects are still going to be traditional design, bid, build projects that all of the local contractors are comfortable with. But any savings doing it through P3 is just more of those projects that we can do and get to.
I can jump in on the procurement process in Florida real quick. We go through an established process, have been pretty consistent, where when we're considering a P3, first we're introducing it to the public, we're presenting it at MPO meetings, Metropolitan Planning Organization meetings. We enter into an industry forum in which we have industry come, but we also have the public can come as well. We talk about the project, talk about the benefits of the planned approach, but we also go through an iterative process with the construction industry, and teams tend to form at these forums, and then we have one-on-one meetings with them and get feedback along the way. Then when we're ready, we put out a request for qualifications. We then qualify a short list of proposers. They've formed their teams. They're conglomerates made of contractors, designers, operators, financiers. Once we have the short list, we again go through that iterative process, put out an RFP that's on a website that people can see, and then ultimately set the date for the final RFP, open bids in a public meeting, and have a competitive process.
Yeah, in Virginia, we build in on a lot of steps. First of all, our office, the Office of Transportation Public-Private Partnerships, writes the guides, manuals, and everything that are adopted by the other transportation agencies, the Department of Transportation, Rail, Public Transportation, even the Commercial Spaceflight Authority. So we have a common set of guidelines. We have an PPTA working group that does include citizens as well as officials, that gives a high-level review of what we're doing and whether or not this is the best avenue for a project. At each stage, we're posting material on the website, and we're pushing it out as well through emails to a contact group of people who've signaled that they're interested going forward. We consult with our General Assembly members regularly. We have a steering committee of the transportation agency heads that actually makes a policy and review and other decisions to proceed. Under our process, once we start toward a procurement, the department that's actually going to carry the procurement forward becomes our partner with our office and are involved at that point. They bring their process to it, the public hearing process, the public comment process. And then, of course, as you mentioned, MPOs, we also have the governing Commonwealth Transportation Board of citizen members. We have local and state budget decisions that people feed into. And as we've discovered, even elections have signals that they send about project activity. So at the end, I want to emphasize again, we also have an independent audit that's done after we develop a project and are further along in a procurement to make sure, and it's paid for by the private sector partner, to make sure we're still true to our original intent. We're still filling the needs, that the financing package we've put together is actually accurate and honest and effective. So all those things we hope help ensure that it's an open process. It's not a closed-door negotiation. It's not somehow private sector scamming the public sector, that the public interest is looked at every step.
Yes, Maryland borrowed virtually every single one of those public engagement best practices and the disclosure processes. One additional degree of a check and balance that I think is somewhat unique relative to the other state statutes that I've looked at. Maryland has a requirement that a public-private partnership go through two stages of approval. On the front end of a project, we're required to submit a report for a 45-day review period by our budget committees in our General Assembly, and they typically will hold hearings to look at the public value proposition associated with the project and to evaluate our preliminary analysis. And that includes looking at our value for money analysis. That includes looking at the alternatives, really on a pretty high level, determining whether or not it makes sense to pursue the project as a P3. And then when that 45-day period is over, we have to go to our public contracting body, which is our Board of Public Works. It's a three-member body of our comptroller, treasurer, and governor, for them to provide preliminary consent for us to even begin a solicitation process. So they evaluate the public policy questions that are called by the P3 project, and they also look at our plan of solicitation. If at that point in time they're uncomfortable with this policy, we don't go forward. If they want us to handle the solicitation differently, we would make a revision at that stage. And then we go into the solicitation process, not unlike was described by my colleagues here. And then at the back end, we go back to the General Assembly for a 30-day review. Hearings are held, reports are filed, the deal is explained, the contract is posted online, and we have to go to the Board of Public Works again for their vote. Other procurements in the state only go to the Board of Public Works once. So we have an additional degree of oversight and scrutiny that's focused on these projects, and the proposition is that we're asking for more flexibility in how we solicit and structure these projects. Therefore, we should be subject to a greater degree of involvement from not only the General Assembly, but also the Board of Public Works.
And are you still seeing involvement from the smaller contractors, or is this going to push them out of business?
Our experience has been that there's been good teaming with national and local contractors on our two previous projects, and we're seeing teaming across international, national, and regional players on our large Purple Line project.
That's our experience, too.
Good.
I wanted to make an additional comment. I referred to it earlier. but we're traditionally looking at citizens as voters or as taxpayers. But because of the market being involved in a P3, there's also a fourth identity there, and that's a consumer of transportation service, he or she knowing what he or she values and will pay for. So one woman, for example, mentioned to me, I pay all that money for my son's baseball shoes and equipment and gloves and uniforms. Why wouldn't I pay a couple bucks to get him to practice or to the games on time? In other words, she's seeing it as a part of a whole experience that she's paying for. And being late is not something she wants. So the market brings that consumer-based discipline to the process. So it's not just we may feel the need or see the need for a project. The market's now signaling there's a market need that potentially has financial support from the users. And that's actually what we capture. It's an interesting validation of what we intuitively understand. We need a new bridge like Mrs. Miller was talking about, or we need a tunnel, additional tunnel tube or capacity on a highway. And the market signal is what prompts the financing opportunity. So it's a validation of the need, but it's also then a creative way to get at something we may not be able to get at otherwise.
A long-term highway bill would probably make Mrs. Miller happy, too.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I want to apologize to you, Mr. Barletta. I kept you waiting far too long, and I apologize to Mr. Capuano for interrupting him to get to Mr. Barletta, but go ahead, and you can go ahead.
I just wanted to, again, most of the numbers, I'm looking at the 595 numbers that you provided. And again, it's questions. Part of this is because different people analyze different things. But a couple of things that jumped at me, and again, the questions, I'm just using August 2007. It doesn't much matter. I'm not comparing 2009. And it's the vertical numbers, not the horizontal ones that matter to me. And you've got 12% CEI, and I assume DBF is a typical funding, traditional funding.
DBF is the short-term contractor financing advancement, but you would have, typically in a DBF, you would have DOT funding in a 5-year work program cycle.
It's more typical.
Yes, it would be very similar to a typical design build.
But you got 12% CEI, 10% risk contingency, 5% construction cost overrun, then a little lower you get 20% operating period expense overrun, and 10% O&M contract renewal overrun, which is, those numbers are just staggering. And on the other, versus a concession of only 5% risk contingency and 5% operation risk contingency. Is the state of Florida's DOT really that bad? You're really that terrible compared to private enterprise? Or am I reading these numbers wrong?
Well, I think you have to contemplate a Florida DOT is naturally going to be conservative. You're going to have, whether it's 595 or the Port of Miami Tunnel, you're going to look at potentially a longer construction period, potentially looking at different phases of the project being brought in together. So our contingencies, our overrun projections typically are going to be in that 10 to 20%.
Why?
Port of Miami Tunnel, I think we went up to 20%, simply because we don't do a lot of tunnels in Florida. So we looked at a design bid build approach in the Port of Miami Tunnel, for example.
But I accept the tunnel. As I said, I see these specialty items as understandably more amenable to P3s. Not a road. You got plenty of roads in Florida.
Actually, 595 was unique. Express lanes in the middle, reversible express lanes, not something we had ever done before in Florida. Not an engineer, not sure I could go back in time and give you every detail behind their logic.
See, the problem I have is, again, is trying to get apples to apples. And it goes back to the point that Mr. Fazio made when we get the Ottawa study. They seem to just pick out this 20%, 27% number to make the numbers work. And honestly, if I had a 20% overrun in every single project, some projects have them, I get that, I'd be firing people in DOT left and right. And if it's the thing that's presumed that you're going to have a 20% overrun, maybe you better go private on every single project that the state undertakes and fire everybody at DOT. And that's just one of that's only one number. That doesn't add the 10% overrun in O&M and the 10% overrun in construction. 40% potential overrun on a relatively typical construction project? You understand what that kind of raises bells to me?
I would again say that we don't typically do a $1 billion construction project with multiple contractors interfacing, building reversible express lanes, complicated interchanges with the turnpike, et cetera.
Florida roads didn't strike me as any different. I mean, Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts.
One other point I would like to make is that you look at our bids that come in. We had it happen very recently on I-4. We're seeing a wide range of bids. So it's not just Florida that sometimes takes a conservative view.
Well, I understand that.
I see hundreds of millions of dollars of difference in the bid price.
Bids are different. I mean, I get all that, but you're going to get the same. The private sector is going to get the same bids. I mean, they're private entities, and to be perfectly honest, that's the thing that I came to the conclusion is, design build. That's one way to just get things going faster. I get that. I understand it, but even in the traditional financing world, it's not state employees who are putting the shovel in the ground. It's private employees who are putting the shovel in the ground. And therefore, why should there be a 20% overrun or 40% potential overrun on building a road? I will tell you, though, that the one thing I loved, because no one else has done this that I've seen, you've got 40% set aside for tax benefits that go to the individuals, to the private entities. And it's the question I've asked. No one else has addressed it. You have, and I appreciate it because it's the unspoken thing. Every one of these is a secret little way for each one of your states to bring more federal tax dollars into your state, not directly to you, but through the tax benefits that these people get. Which I don't blame them. I'm a former tax lawyer when I used to make money and had a life, but not a bad thing. Not doing anything wrong. None of you get a tax benefit when you do it traditionally. There is no tax benefit, and that tax benefit, 35%, is directly out of the federal general treasury, directly out of the federal general treasury, which is your tax dollars. And I understand. I don't blame you for grabbing it. I blame us for not counting that as part of the loss that it cost us. You're counting what it cost you in all kinds of saying what it cost you in your own money, TIFIA and then PABs. And by the way, I'd like to point out, I don't know if you noticed, but the tax proposal that was put out by the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee repeals private activity bonds. So just beware. We're not going to pass it at the moment, but it's on the table. But nobody wants to count into the extra money how much the federal government and the state government, to some extent, loses or gives away in these tax benefits that wouldn't otherwise exist if these roads were publicly owned. But you did it, and I really want to appreciate it. I mean, and I don't blame any of you, don't get me wrong. Your job is to grab as many federal dollars as you can, and you're doing a good job, so I don't have any concern with that. But and again, I don't know 595, but is it a typical toll road, or I know you get some express.
595, we took an existing quarter and we added 3 reversible express lanes with variable tolls.
Oh, so tolls are just on those lanes?
We added capacity, and those are the lanes that are getting tolled.
I appreciate it, because a lot of these P3s have been done on traditional toll roads. I mean, the hot lanes and everything. I'm leaving you alone with your Pocahontas. That's a different issue. But the question I had for Indiana, I thought was very simple questions. How much were the tolls before you went private? How much are the tolls now? How many cars use the toll road before you had it? And how many cars don't or use it now? The idea is there's a traffic diversion factor that may or may not play into it. I don't know. Because part of my concern with a lot of these things, and again, that's why I'm more comfortable with the specialized aspects, but on a typical road, the truth is it's a lot easier for a private entity to raise toll rates.
And one thing in Florida that I will point out, and nothing against toll revenue risk deals, we would consider that something to consider for future projects and always evaluate toll deals. But with the availability payment mechanism, we've retained the toll rate control and just opened the 595 express lanes and are controlling.
So the questions I have in toll roads doesn't seem to apply to this one. I appreciate it. Thank you all very much. And thank you for these numbers. I really do appreciate the numbers you gave us. And
yes, sir.
It still leaves a lot of questions, but it's a lot more than I've gotten in the past.
Well, Mr. Capuano, I think you referred to the general. There's this awkward struggle to get to the future. And we've got one foot in the old system and one foot in the new financing tools that we have. and they don't always allow us to maintain our balance. So that's one reason. I know in our process, we've overhauled our process at least 3 or 4 times as we learned. Pocahontas Parkway probably would not go forward under the current screening and implementation guidelines we have now. We learned from those experiences.
I don't hold mistakes against anybody. I've made a few in my life, and my answer, as long as you learn from them, that's not a problem.
Yeah, so I think the policy framework that we're talking about, there are some new roles for the federal government, there are some new roles for the states, and increasingly roles for the localities as well, and how we allocate resources, the mechanisms that we use, how much we do go to the market for guidance and support, and how much really we retain to make sure the public interest is actually served.
That's what's, I'm a former mayor, former city councilor, former state employee. You know, I don't have any problem with new stuff, but I will tell you I have a real problem with spending all of tomorrow's money today, because there will be a Congress and there'll be a DOT tomorrow when we're all retired, and I don't want the next generation to have no money to play with because we just burnt it all away. But the projects we all want, every one of us has more projects that we want than we can afford. Every one of us does. And with an extra financing tool, I'm always concerned about the human nature of grabbing it all and spending it now and let somebody else worry about the consequences, not intentionally. And I'm not trying to make it sound as a bad thing, but by pure circumstance.
Well, and we're very aware of deferral risk, that there's always a tendency to want to defer operations and maintenance or
it's the first thing that goes when there's budget cuts.
Exactly. And so, as someone else pointed out earlier, if you can make that a part of a contract with a private sector partner, they're on the contract to have to do that. They don't get to defer it.
But the
later,
flip side of that is when you have an availability payment that you can't adjust when you start laying off cops and teachers and firefighters. Yeah. Then you've given that ability away, so that you may have 500 fewer state police officers because you have to live up to these contracts to maintain a road. Now, I'm not saying that that's good, bad, or indifferent, but it's a legitimate public policy question, is where tax dollars should go. Do your citizens, my citizens, do they want their dollars 20 years from now to go to pay for a road that's a good road, wonderful road, well-maintained, or would they really rather have, oh, look, we've all made these decisions, defer a little capital and keep the 500 cops? And I don't like prejudging that question, because I've faced it as a mayor. And I didn't like having my hands tied by my predecessors. And these questions, you're 100% right to ask those questions. And I'm a big transportation advocate, but I'm also a public safety advocate, an educational advocate, a healthcare advocate. And those questions become a concern. When you start availability payments, what's the next governor going to say if they have a different crisis? And the answer is, and I know you can't answer that question, but it's something I have to ask, because we are tying their hands to some degree. And it's just, and I don't have an answer for it. I'm aware of it.
Yeah, one thing from our perspective, I know right now there's actually a lot of discussion as to whether availability payments are debt. Frankly, I don't think it matters, because we're going to treat it as a long-term obligation regardless of whether the agency is classified as debt. And that's why we're talking about even putting a policy in place that we won't do availability payments beyond a certain percentage of our budget. That we're comfortable having a portion of our budget that goes to debt service or financing payments or whatever you want to call it. But there is a point where you don't want it to be basically off-book borrowing, where you've tapped out your ability to go to the bond market, so now you're just looking at a new way.
You may think it's off-book. It won't be off-book to the credit rating.
Yeah, exactly. But the point is, I think that it's important that's a responsibility that I know our governor and our secretary take very seriously, is that we're not going to over-leverage ourselves, which is why, frankly, a 500-600 bridge project wasn't going to happen until the transportation funding package happened this past year, because we wouldn't have been able to afford it. It would have been taking out the credit card to do projects that we simply wouldn't be able to afford, and we would have been hamstringing the next generation of folks to take over.
Could I just add, in Florida, AAA rated state, there are some controls in place in statute that contain how much we can extend on the P3s. And so there's a 15% cap of federal and state funding, for example, in any given year that can be obligated towards a P3. In terms of the state's debt, it's looked at the CapEx portion, the capital expense portion of an availability payment, not the portion that's paying for the operations and maintaining the facility over time. That's considered debt in Florida. So there are some controls in place, And that's why we're pretty selective. That's why we're looking at the bigger, complex, risky projects and thinking carefully about the commitment we're making with those availability payments.
Yeah, in Maryland, our treasurer has, at least now, designated the availability payment, the capital portion of the availability payment as non-traditional, non-tax supported debt that has a separate treatment in terms of the cap that's applied to it that's different from tax supported debt. But it is being factored in, it is being calculated along with other non-traditional financing. And to reiterate what Brian said, we never would have advanced this P3 without the legislature in Annapolis passing a gas tax. So this is not a workaround.
Let me ask that question. I meant to ask it earlier. I've now heard two, but the other two states, have you got a revenue component in the last couple of years, either additional taxes or reallocation of existing taxes into transportation issues?
Yes, we did.
And did Florida?
I'm not totally familiar. We haven't raised our gas tax in Florida.
Say it again, I'm sorry?
We haven't raised our gas tax in Florida. It's indexed with inflation.
Or it is indexed, so it's a de facto increase. Believe me, I wish we could index.
Yeah, well, Virginia passed a big bill. It got a lot of publicity up here and all over the
Appreciate it.
Well, I tell you, you can see that there's a lot of interest in what you all had to say because I can tell you just about every member went way over the traditional 5 minutes that we give everybody, but that's all right. Mr. Coulibaly, you mentioned at at the beginning of your testimony that you all had done 12. I think you said 12 major projects and 3 were over $4 billion. Was that correct?
I said we'd done more than a dozen, and we did 3 in 2012 that were worth $4 billion. Probably the total is more like 3 or 4 times that.
Well, let me ask you this. Everybody in business likes to talk about their successes. Every sportsman likes to talk about their best games, not their worst. Were there any of these projects that you thought in the end shouldn't have been done as public-private partnerships? Or tell me what was your most difficult one or the one you had the most problems with? Give me some examples.
Yeah, I think I mentioned, for example, that we had screened out a number of different projects,
right.
Even recently. For example, tolling I-95 border to border to North Carolina and Maryland in the district. The Potomac River ferry that was proposed to run from Occoquan up to Washington as a potential transit opportunity. Not really an investment opportunity, maybe a demonstration project or a subsidized transit project. I-64 and Hampton Roads, we studied whether or not availability payments might be available there and decided there was not an MPO support for tolling that would have supported some type of project activity there. So I think the one that's been in the news more recently is the US 460 project that runs from Hampton Roads to south of Richmond. Our office, I was not there then, but our office conducted the high-level and detail-level screenings about it and quite frankly found it was not a good project for P3 purposes. The public subsidy was going to be very large. There wasn't an interest from the private sector in putting in equity into the project because it looked like the revenue and use numbers didn't support that effort. So our governor at the time and Secretary of Transportation decided they wanted to continue to proceed under our PPTA Act procurement, primarily, I believe, because of delay of having to start over under a design build or other approach. And as right now that project's halted because we haven't gotten the requisite Army Corps of Engineers environmental permit. So there's one thing. I mean, we're all familiar with traffic lights. The yellow light's on. Sometimes you move through the intersection. Sometimes you slow down and stop in anticipation. So our governor stopped work on that project now until we get the permit, until we get the ability to go forward. So that was kind of a false start that we learned from, that we actually need to be more rigorous, not only in our analysis, but disciplined in our decision-making when we do have these screenings that are showing us the risks may not be allocated or.
When did you all do your first P3, your first public-private partnership in Virginia? Do you know?
You know, I couldn't tell you. Dusty, I don't know if you know.
1998.
1998, I guess.
Well, you're talking about, you were just talking about projects that you decided to either not do or one that's been delayed. Have you had any that you think the projections were way off, or that it was a mistake to go into as a public-private partnership?
Well, I think we've been a little surprised at the range of differences in the actual
Or have most
performance.
of these projects surprised you about how they've done a lot better than what
Well,
you
in the
expected?
performance vis-a-vis our revenue or our traffic estimates.
Right.
You know, those are, we think we have a good idea of how those things work because we have models, we have data, we have examples, we have expertise. But the fact is, it comes down to whether you and I would decide to use the road on a regular basis or not, and that's a decision we may make on a daily basis. So,
Well, the one
Well, we have
what
seen-
the one was in 1998, but you've had 16 years experience
Sure.
with that. Has that turned out to be a good project or
I think
in between?
I think they've turned out to be good projects by and large. What we've learned is the ramp-up period often is longer than we expect.
Okay.
It's not like an iPhone where you put a new one on the market and bam, 1 million people go buy it the first day. So
Okay. I see.
we also understand, particularly on the Hot Lanes project, for example, which is now being, that concept extended on 95, is it takes a little while for people to understand how they're going to use the facility and also to get the technology, that transponder, that makes it an easy trip. You don't have to stop and pay, and so forth. So there's a ramp-up period as you go, anytime you have a new facility.
All right, thank you. Mr. Dormshow, let me see if I've got these figures correct, and I'm sure I don't, on this terminal project. But you said in a good year, the terminal was producing a profit of $1 million to $1.5 million or something like that, and in a bad year, it was sometimes losing as much as $4 million. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And then you came in and you told this company, which they tell me is Ports America,
Right.
you told them they had to give you double what was made during its best year. Is that correct?
Right.
So that's where you mentioned a $3 million yearly payment.
Right.
I mean, we're talking roughly now. I mean, not
Yeah.
exactly. So they're paying you $3 million a year, but then you talked about you said 110 million and 140 million. You said a payment of 250 million total. Is that correct?
Yeah, up front.
Up front. So they came in and paid you 250 million in advance. And then they had to guarantee you that they would pay you $3 million a year on a business that never made more than $1.5 million. I mean, I can tell you that this is the fifth one of these, of our 5 hearings and roundtables. We've had a lot of good witnesses. In fact, I can't think of a bad one, and all 4 of you have been great. But boy, this really makes an impression on me. I'm not sure if somebody came to me with almost any business and offered me a deal like that I would take it. I don't know. It's hard for me to believe that they can do that. That there's that much difference there. But you said you think that if you hadn't done this as a public-private partnership, that it probably would have been delayed. You said.
Yeah, we did not have the $110 million for the berth and the 4 post-Panamax cranes in our budget.
Right. Okay. And on this Purple Line project, what's the private percentage? You said it's $900 million was a grant from the DOT. How much was the TIFIA loan part?
Well, this project hasn't been commercially closed or financially closed, so we're right in the middle of the process.
Oh, you're still
our loan, the size of the TIFIA loan is between $700 and $800 million. We're
7 and 8.
We're negotiating that with TIFIA right now.
What is your total, the estimate on the total project altogether?
2.3 billion.
2.3. And so you're not certain yet how much what the private percentage is going to be?
Right. That's subject to TIFIA's,
Right.
preferences for the loan. It's subject to the bidding. It's subject to negotiation. But, we're thinking that, it's reasonable to anticipate that the equity, would be about 10% of the overall project.
Okay. All right. Mr. Kendrow, you mentioned the Davis-Bacon cap that it had been raised for the first time in 50 years or a long time.
This is the state prevailing wage law that applies
Right.
to only transportation projects. So
Right.
basically highway.
What was the cap and what was it? How was it changed?
The cap was raised, I think, to 100,000. It was about like 50,000. And the benefit was primarily to local governments on local projects. Most of our projects already are going to come in above 100,000.
Yeah, that sounds like a pretty low amount.
Yeah, but to some of the more rural communities, they viewed it as a significant benefit to them.
Really?
So that was something that they advocated for as part of the funding package.
And you said when you were testifying that one of the main advantages of public-private partnerships was that public-private partnerships would accelerate the delivery. Why is that? Why do you think that is?
Two reasons. One, in the same vein as if you were to go out and do traditional public financing, you're getting the cash now to go ahead and do the project. So I think that's the obvious one. The other less obvious one is just the pressures that are created with a lot of these contracts and the ability for the contractors and the development entities to start getting paid back. There's a lot of built-in incentive for them to deliver the project on time, on budget, if not even quicker. So there's a lot more incentive than in your traditional design build procurement to get a project even once it gets to the beginning of construction to get it completed faster. And I guess a couple of other things that I think are worth mentioning is on a typical design bid build project, especially of the size of $500 million, $1 billion, there might be dozens of contracts that are all being administered by the department, whether that's design contracts, construction contracts, maintenance contracts. So I think some of the ability to mitigate any delay risk is just you have far less interfaces in the administration of the project for delay within the DOT, because obviously we don't have an infinite amount of resources. A lot of state agencies have caps in terms of complement. We're not going to go out and hire people just for one specific project. So by putting a lot of that responsibility over to the private sector, they do have the ability to meet kind of spikes in need in delivering a project. So if there's a critical point where there's a whole series of reviews, whether it's permit reviews or otherwise, the permit applications that need to be submitted, they have the ability to maybe manage that a little better than we would on our end if we're the ones kind of controlling the design process, for instance.
All right. And I wasn't clear on exactly, you were talking about some project where you had a prohibition on future tolls.
No, I was just explaining kind of the P3 board approval process, the appointed board, that essentially if they approved a project that didn't have tolls on it, the department wouldn't have any authority to go ahead and add tolls to that project. Our legislation is broad enough that it could conceive of a toll project. We're not pursuing any toll projects right now, but there's nothing prohibiting us from doing. I believe a couple other states have either solely authority to do tolling projects. I think Texas, for instance, their P3 authorization is only for tolling projects, and other states may have prohibitions, but in Pennsylvania, our language is pretty flexible.
Okay. All right, Mr. Corbett, you said in your testimony that you think the private sector, one of the advantages is that there's much more interest in innovation. Now, why is that? What do you mean by that? And can you give us an example of where you've seen that?
Yeah, I think first of all, when you have the private investment involved, there's an incentive built in. they're going to innovate in their design. They're in a competitive environment with our procurement, so they're trying to find new design innovations that'll deliver efficiencies. On the Port of Miami tunnel in particular, I think they really, again, not an engineer, but they did some things with the tunnel boring machine that were very innovative that the department hadn't thought of. They reduced the depth of the tunnels. The department had a thought of that. They brought the tubes closer together. And again, not an engineer, but apparently the department had them farther apart. They froze the ground to build tunnels between the two tunnels. So there was a lot of...
Who was that did that?
The construction firm was Bouygues, and the consortium is Miami Access Tunnel, made up of investment firms, O&M contractors, et cetera.
All right, well, I've got appointments that started in my office at 3:30, and I'm a little bit behind, and so I'm going to let you all go. I know you'll be happy, be glad about that, but you've been great witnesses. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Good job, Joe. Thank you. As usual. Oh, well. Oh. Well, by the time they get to me, about every question's been asked that could be asked. So maybe one day I'm going to shock everybody and go first.